the start button. 1, 2. Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is December 10, 2024. Want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. Please subscribe. Also want to thank the New York Finnegan's Wake Reading Group and James Joyce for introducing me to today's guest, Nick Montfort. Where are you calling from, Nick?
So I am here in New York City in the East Village.
How cool is that? First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
I'm not sure there's one best thing for all human beings. I wouldn't want to put my answer to that, if I could even come up with one, onto anybody else. But I will say that, you know, we now have a 5.5-month-old daughter, and for a long time there were no children in my life, and that's certainly been the best thing so far for me, after, you know, a long time with creative projects and stimulating sorts of reading and my relationship with my spouse when it's been the two of us.
That's a great answer. I appreciate that. What year were you born?
1972.
What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Well, I would say I really like to have a diversity of forms. So I'm maybe not the most severe sort of cinephile, but I really enjoy watching movies. I don't know whether people consider that, movies and TV are different forms, right? Because there's different structures and economics around making these two types of motion pictures. They're both types of motion pictures. But I'm much more into movies, and I'd rather watch movies again and again that I find some value in. And in fact, I own a lot of movies. This is not a form either, but I own a lot of movies on optical disc, which many people find very strange these days. You know, I have a turntable and a small number of records, but ones that I care about and like. And I do a lot of work with early digital media, video game systems and home computers and things like that. So I have a, Commodore 64 and an Apple IIc set up in the next room. And the work that I do on those systems, like the material nature of those systems, is important to me as well. So I'd say I'm not really so much about the form, but I'm about understanding material differences.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you can play, if it's a sort of, the form might be something like a jumper video game where, you have a button that causes you, like Super Mario Brothers, where you're able to jump. That's the main action that you take within the game, and that's a sort of form. Or a shoot 'em up, or there's different sort of genres of video game. I'm not so much interested in any of the genres, but I'm interested in how the material nature of a particular game system or particular computer, has to do with that. And similarly, I'm really into, I participate in the book arts. So I'm interested in the book as a material object, not just a vessel for some text that's in it, but, a means of working artistically through language and other types of interactions and engagements.
Thanks for being concise and articulate, Nick. I really appreciate this. And 2 divert questions really quick. Did you become a reader, 1, because your parents told you, 2, they did it as an example, or 3, on your own?
Well, so it's not only my parents, but also the influence of, schools. When I was very young, kindergarten, elementary school, and so forth. But I don't think that, so there weren't a lot of books in our house growing up, but when my parents saw that I had some interest in reading, they were very, very supportive of it. They were able to provide me with, I mean, not only buying books for me that I was interested in or buying an encyclopedia set, but taking me to the library. So I would say I have to, it wasn't that I was trying to imitate something that they were doing, but once I started being engaged with poetic language, imaginative worlds, things like this, they leaned into that and supported me in a variety of different ways.
Super, Nick. And let's go back to the movies. I call it moving image art.
Sure.
And you really, that was interesting that you said movies. Now, there's a movie experience on the big screen, and then there's a movie experience on the smaller screen. And just to go to your background, what's the most impactful moving image experience you had early in your life that you can recall, like seeing this movie in this movie theater or seeing this TV show on a TV set? What was it, and what form was it?
Well, I think that there's things I remember for very different reasons. So, Raiders of the Lost Ark is not a film that, or moving picture art work that has really stuck with me. But my grandfather took me to see it, and this is one of the first things that we saw in the cinema, and he was very close to me. And so that was important for that reason. It was also like a stimulating movie. It was an adventure film that was, really exciting.
That's what I'm looking for. So your granddad took you to Raiders on the big screen, and it was more like the ritual of your granddad and all that. Now a film that made an impact on you, besides who took you to it, like that you went, wow, this is moving image art,
Yeah. So there's many of these I could go down. I don't want to try to pick what's the top one, but I've just been talking with some people recently, including a bartender at a restaurant who saw The Matrix for the first time, right? And it not only was that, and it remains an incredible film, one of many in 1999. 1999 was, it was almost something like film noir emerging, not of course the same themes, but some type of new radical project of film. And I could list a bunch of things that year from, Fight Club, being John Malkovich, Magnolia, maybe that was a year off, but just a huge amount of incredible creative cinema that year. But The Matrix was also something that, it's really hard for people nowadays, even if they still appreciate the computer graphics, it's hard for them to understand the impact of that going to the cinema, where there were no previews for the film. So they just put up a slide that said, "What is The Matrix?" and the date that it was being released. There was a website you could go on to, but that was a bizarre type of thing to do in 1999 still. So people really didn't know what they were getting into. They were just intrigued. And the other thing is, even after opening weekend, it wasn't as common to just go on the internet and people would tell you what the film was about, it was still an earlier time. So I think I and other people going to see that movie in Italy just staggered out of the theater, finding it utterly mind-blowing.
That's a great image. It's like George Romero making a film, zombies staggering out of the Matrix, because when the Matrix came out, the bookstore I was doing events at, the star Keanu Reeves came in and bought every McLuhan book, because he knew the people who made that film were studying McLuhan. And then at a protest I was
and
at,
Baudrillard, obviously, which is it's actually in the film. There's that book, right?
Yeah. And then there's a T-shirt I saw at a protest for Black Lives Matter, and it said "The Matrix was a documentary." Is a documentary.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to information. This great, Nick. You really get it, and I appreciate. Why do humans collect or gather information?
Mm. So, to me, the more puzzling thing is why we collect material, why we hoard things. And I mean, my hoard is very, neatly organized, but I'm a book hoarder of
Yeah.
sorts, right? And I think, I mean, one of the reasons is it's our evolutionary advantage. I mean, we have culture, and we have neonoteny, the ability of the young of our species to, through neuroplasticity, shape their mental processes and to learn. And so, if there's something for them to learn about, if we have collected that information, which not only is it static information, right? Not only is it, for instance, a map of where are there rapids on the river, right? But it's dynamic information about, like, a great piece of a great informational document is the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, right? Because it contains information about how to build a raft, in addition to containing a lot of information about how to be a good public speaker and how to influence your community and so forth. But there's actually, this encyclopedic portion of the Odyssey where all the tools that you need and the process that you need to produce the simplest sort of boat for a Mediterranean society, right, is just laid out. Right? It tells you how to do that. So the Odyssey is an informational document, and that predates, although we have it in written form, that predates writing. I mean, people were reciting that text, something like it, orally, right, to try to keep that cultural knowledge alive and codified. Right. So I think those are the reasons. It's so we can do things culturally.
Yeah, that was good. This writer was on the radio, and she says, my mom was raised in the Bahamas with no book reading, but she knew what to do when a tsunami hit because of the songs they sang. The song told, like, that how to build a raft in public speak was brilliant. Really appreciate you bringing that up. And you kind of went into this, but is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented?
Well, I think it's tied in. I think some of it is innate, because I do think the evolutionary advantage of human beings is that we have neonoteny and that we're able to learn from our culture. And so if there were no innate ability to develop a culture, that wouldn't go very far. So I do think some of it, without having any of the evolutionary biological chops to back this up, right? My impulse is certainly that some of that is innate, and you see it throughout the world. You see it whether or not people have books. They might be or text at all. They might be a primary oral culture, right? As the Greeks were at one point in history, right? So yeah, I think there is.
Yeah, that's what I'm after. Your impulse, your guess, your intuition. I really appreciate it. And the fact that you asked a question, why do we hoard? I'm also, the process here is more like me and you versus the wording on the questions. So I'm all for rewording my verbs, nouns, changing them, saying, well, I would ask this. I'm also after tangents, any kind of stories and anecdotes are real. I really welcome them. In other words, you don't have to answer the question. But the next one is, do thoughts create emotions?
Well, emotions are thoughts. They're cognition. Emotions are types of cognition. They're just not what we consider rational cognition. So, I mean, even when if you put your hand on, hot plate that you didn't realize it was turned on, or otherwise, like you experience pain, right? That's a type of cognition. It's very, very low level perceptual type of cognition. So everything is sort of a system. I'm not saying you can therefore master, you can walk on fire or things like that, but these are all part of human cognition. And so when it comes to more complex things that we talk about as emotions, then certainly thoughts can cause emotions. I mean, there's the paradox of fiction, which is when we enter an imaginative world by reading a novel, why do we get sad and sometimes cry about, you know, like the death of a character in there, or the suffering of a character? Because we know that's not real. I mean, we understand it's fiction. No, if you ask the person who's weeping, did somebody die, and you know who you know, they'd be like, no, I'm just reading a book. That's very, you know, it's a novel. It's very sad, right? So certainly thoughts can certainly cause emotions.
Yeah, I've got a lecture called Psychosomatic Cinema, and that's the same thing. It's like, you know, anyways, that was good. I really appreciate what you said, but that is your study somewhat neuroscience, or that sort of sounded like a neuroscientist saying emotions are cognition, or do you cross over from your computer studies into neuroscience?
I would say the short answer is no, I don't. And I have read a little bit, mostly in graduate school, about, from like behavioral economic perspectives. I've read about people who did various types of neuroeconomic or neuroscientific types of studies. Neuroeconomics is how do people make important decisions, you know, and how can we find that out by sticking someone in an MRI, for instance. But the type of cognitive science that I am the best versed in, although I come to it as an outsider, is cognitive linguistics, and then specifically conceptual metaphor theory, you know, the contemporary theory of metaphor that George Lakoff, along with
there you go, thank you,
and Mark Johnson and Rafael Nunez and others, you know, have developed. So that's the type of cognitive science. And then conceptual blending by Gilles Faconier. So these sorts of ideas, right?
Good.
But yeah, so I don't, and in that case, what I'm trying to do is apply those ideas.
Yeah.
Surprisingly enough, this extremely rich body of a totally new understanding of metaphor that's arisen in the past several decades. Poets are mostly clueless about it. You find people who've gotten their PhDs, you know, in poetry, or, you know, have been through the MFA programs and stuff, and they still think that this is, you know, a little. So there's some figurative language here, like it's sort of it's a trope, like it's like making puns, or you know, the people don't understand this very central role of metaphor, I think.
That's well, I hope we get into that, because you said so much there that brought up so many things. Is McLuhan called himself Applied Joyce, and Joyce called him, because Joyce called himself Applied Aquinas. But the metaphor thing I really want to get into, but I'm glad you brought up Lakoff. It gave me some grounding where you're coming from. But this is McLuhan, because settling for an aphorism is fun. Oh, wow, I learned from that cute aphorism, you know, that maxim, that line. But he says, no, the point is to take it a little farther. And so he took Robert Browning's our search should exceed our grasp, or what is heaven for, to our search should exceed our grasp, or what is a metaphor.
Yes.
And see, that's what I love about your
input. There's a pun, which, or as it's the official rhetorical name for it, paranomasia, right? Which is in Shakespeare. Shakespeare uses puns too.
Yeah.
Me tomorrow and you'll find me a grave man, in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio.
Yeah, right? And in the wake where the hand of man never set foot. That sounds like a Saturday Night Live line. But that's what I like about your input in the wake, because you're not just settling and analyzing Joyce. You're trying to do what he did and take it a little further, like, you know, Echo ripped off. You stand on the shoulders of giants and look farther. Okay, Nick, the next one is fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
Well, I definitely don't know what I think. I'm not sure if I ever know what I think, but I don't know what I think until I do some writing or actual execution, for instance, of a project. I can't, come up with a concept, come up with an outline, and then fill it out. That's not the way that I work. I work, in a more bottom-up way. I will say that there's a moment in projects when, almost always, when I know what it's going to be called, I understand the name of it, right? And to me, that the name is not just sort of a brand name. It's not just something catchy where we check to see if the focus group likes it or whatever else, but it serves as a miniature constitution for that particular activity. Like I know from the name what's happening in that project. So I worked with the co-editor Lillian von Bertram on this book that was just published a month ago, and we knew what it would be. We knew it would be an anthology of computer-generated text. We knew it would span a long time, but coming up with the name Output, right, clarified that not only as something facing outwards, but then we realized, okay, well, this is how, we're going to make selections, because people have used the computer in various ways. They've tried to collaborate with it. They've tried to generate some stuff and then sort of, bring it into their process and mix it up and so forth. But we have to draw boundaries somewhere. This book ended up being just over 500 pages, 200 selections. So we chose to say, as the title says, output. We just want, when you run a computer program, text comes out. That's what we're going to select for this project. And there'll be many other projects. In fact, there's already a literary magazine, Ensemble Park, that has started up, which is human computer collaboration. So, by people that I know, and there's other projects along these lines. So I think, working on something, working through it, doing the work, but also that moment when the title snaps into place is very important for me.
That is for me too, a really articulate. That is Joyce, love thy label as thyself. But Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Can humans think without language?
Yes. If I were to throw you a ball, you wouldn't need language to either duck or catch it or something, like some very, very sudden reaction, which is, of course, non-human animals do this too. And they're thinking, they have cognition, right? So just like I said, a type of cognition is feeling pain and moving your hand away. A type of cognition is that, you perceptually see a ball coming, right? And there's other more complex things we could say about how, Lakoff and his camp, understand that metaphor itself, embodied in our experience of the world, is actually deeper than language. So even though he's a cognitive linguist, he says that helps us to understand metaphor because we see it in language. It's manifest in language. But that doesn't mean it's a linguistic phenomenon. It's something deeper, and we can peer into it through language. So I think language is particularly important. And I think, language has two major aspects, which is the outward communicative aspect and one's own ability to reflect, plan, and think within oneself.
Yeah.
And so that's something that there's obviously capabilities for reflection, foresight, planning, and so forth, that the type of thinking you do when a ball is coming at you, well, maybe on a very, very small scale, oh, the ball is coming here, I got to move my head. But that probably doesn't, that type of thinking doesn't scale up to, should I take this job? Is it going to be good for me in 4 years? Or should I move to a new city or something like that? Right? That's probably some thinking that involves language inherently.
Nick Chomsky says language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
I'm not sure about that, because I feel like it's sort of like, happy language is all happy in its own way, but unhappy language is all happy in a different way. When language breaks down, I think it's a different case of breakdown each time. It's not what we have here is a failure to communicate, to make my cinematic reference, right? It's not just that type of thing, right? But it's also someone's in it, like, for instance, not all breakdowns of language have to do with communication at all. Some of them have to do with one's own ability to plan, to think about one's future, keeping a diary, or making plans, making a to-do list, or whatever else. And in that case, if you lack, so there might be a concept that's important to you, but if you don't know the term that accompanies that concept, then it makes it much harder for you to think conceptually. That's why we have terminology, which is totally different than what people dismiss as jargon. Terminology is not jargon. It's like when you go to your doctor, and the doctor's saying all these words to a nurse that you don't know. You don't know what these words are. Oh, that's a bunch of jargon. No, actually, that's helping you. That's a medical process, and that communication is very, very helpful, right? So there are communications breakdowns, but there are also conceptual breakdowns. And I don't know what we do in all those cases, but we have to at least identify what type of breakdown it is first.
Yeah, Nick, I like that you said not sure a couple times, because that's, just because I ask these questions, it's like Rebecca Solnit says, just because someone asks you a question doesn't mean you have to answer it. In saying not sure, I don't know, I can't answer that, I welcome that. I'm not trying to put people on the spot. Your observations of humans in general, are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
Well, I guess it compares. You have to ask who you're comparing humans to, right? If we admit that doing arithmetic is thinking, which is not true, but if we were to, right, and we were to therefore think that the computer, a calculating machine, right, was capable of thought because it can do arithmetic, well, we'd say, oh, humans are much more feeling than that. But if we compare human beings to wonderful co-evolved creatures, dogs, then dogs are more, their emotions are more prominent in the relationship. I think so.
But we don't know if dogs have the word emotion. We're putting the word emotion on what they do because of their eyes or their body language.
Okay, but dogs have cognition. Like, we understand they have cognition because, like, you can't do things like how would you fetch a ball without being able to determine where that ball is going, right?
Right, but we don't talk dog language. They might not have the word cognition. I agree with what you're saying, but you know what I'm saying. It's anthropomorphizing these terms on animals. I appreciate that.
Okay, but then I guess the question is, if thought and feeling are unique to human beings, only human beings have thought and feeling, then it doesn't really make any sense to say, are humans more thinking animals, or are they more thinking entities, or are they more emotional entities? Because they have to be both, right?
They have to be both, and that's the woman a year ago says the word more doesn't function in your question. Of course, it's a stupid question, because basically, I'll just tell you the history. 80% of people say, I think we're more feeling beings. And so that's a funny little contradiction right there. We invented the word thinking and feeling, so we think we can separate them. We can't.
That might be right, is what I would say. Yeah.
And so Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. I'm like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off? And there's a bumper sticker on my street on a car. It says, don't believe everything you think. And I say, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel.
Yeah. Well, okay. So some types of feelings are You can talk about them as I don't like to be too computational in my discussion of
Yeah.
human thought, because I think the whole ideas of artificial intelligence, and in fact, most of my colleagues and people, they cannot say anything about what intelligence is without reference to artificial intelligence. They actually
Yeah.
don't know about it. But I'll nevertheless use a computational metaphor, because we always have computational metaphors that are we always have, not computational metaphors, but the latest thing is always part of our metaphorical understanding. Whether it be the Industrial Revolution, we start having industrial metaphors, and then later on we have computational metaphors. So I'll talk about compiling. So when you compile a program, you initially have a bunch of source code. You can change it. You can look at how it works. And the compiled form is something that you don't have that advantage, right? It's compact in size, and it's very fast. Right, it works. So one of the things you can think about as feelings as being what most people call thought. You can imagine what most people call feelings to be compiled thought, right? This is why I don't think there's a strong distinction between them. And so once, over time, and this is again, like dogs who are trained also compile, their behaviors into something, that is more automatic and routine based on their training. So we'd like to think that people do something maybe better or different. But ultimately, I think that difference between, what we mostly understand is thought, and a lot of what we understand is feeling. We can think about a lot of that as being part of that learning or compilation process. But then once it's compiled, if we start feeling aversion to something because of having thought it through, because of past experience and so forth, but that aversion stands on its own now, right? And it might be bias against groups of people, or it might be something that is bad. It's hard to change that, because we've compiled our thinking about this, or our experiences about this, into something, that's more efficient, but that we're less able to introspect about.
Yeah. Nick, I would love to discuss another time a proposal, because New York Wake is asking for proposals for, workshops or whatever, or meetings, and I'd love to do one with you, co-do it. How James Joyce invented the internet. No, how James Joyce invented what's after AI and after the internet, and disguised it as a book. But that's for the future thoughts. These are,
Jerry, I have to mention, that the major blogging service, right? Blogs are a little bit passé now, but WordPress, one word, WORDPRESS, right? That's the major type of blogging software. It's also a company that people can, people can sign up and start their blogs. So the word WordPress is in the wake.
Oh yeah. Oh, there's lots of that. That's amazing. Thank you for telling me that. So, you have ESP because you predicted these next two questions.
Okay.
They're from Alan Turing in the 50s. One is thinking a function of the soul.
Well, I don't believe in souls, so I no. I don't think.
The second Turing question is, can machines think?
Well, so Turing himself said that question was meaningless, and I tend to agree with him about that. So he actually did not write his article about whether machines can think. At the very beginning of that article, he says, that's a meaningless question. Let me dismiss it. And let me replace it with another question, which is, could you be fooled by a computer into thinking that it was a human being? Right. So he's particularly introduced, and then he introduces this imitation game, which is initially about gender. Could you be fooled into thinking that a person of one gender is the person is a person of another gender, right? He introduces this as a party game between people, and then later on he develops that into a way to meaningfully talk about the abilities of computers, right? Because he says that's an empirical question. Can you be fooled by a computer into thinking that you're talking with a human being is an empirical question. Can a computer think is a nonsensical question. And if we have his essay in The New Media Reader, which is a book I had co-edited and was published by MIT Press, actually a little over 20 years ago now, as one of the very early selections in there. So that's been an influential essay for a while, but certainly more so now when people are thinking about AI and are conflating, unfortunately, the language generation capabilities of the computer with thought, which is unrelated to the things that ChatGPT can do, for instance.
That's so important, because that's why I dialogue with people, 4 times a week all over the world, because I want them to, like I said, help me reword the question or rethink the question. So, I just read that once, can machines think? Turing asked that. Now you've made this whole new revelation for me. And I'm wondering if I should keep saying, can machines think? Because people just go into this long rap about it. But if I shifted it to, can machines fool you, or into the exact question he asked? That's what I'm asking you. Can you be fooled by machines? Let's say, put it that way.
So that's a much more interesting question, because then you realize that there's a huge variety of people, and like if I don't understand a language, like could I be fooled into thinking that I'm in an exchange with someone who exclusively speaks Arabic? It's like, well, I can't even read the alphabet. Yeah. So why would I know anything about this? So certainly a computer could fool me that way, right? Yeah. If I had a pure linguistic exchange with essentially, like a baby on the cusp of acquiring language or something, and I was comparing that to what the computer could do. Well, yeah, right. And there's other types of, there's other ways to fool you that I would consider easy, but not interesting.
Yeah.
And so some of those, like essentially my understanding of, the goal of ChatGPT is to develop an automated customer service representative. And the automated customer service representative would do what the analogous human does, which is actually not know anything. Right? They would, in some cases, they might be able to do the tasks that have already been automated that you could do through a phone tree. But if anything else comes up, if you're just irate, they would just try to placate you. Like they don't have any semantics, right, to answer, serious problems that you might be having with. So that's one of the things that I think is important is these systems can be used for information retrieval, which, IBM's award-winning Jeopardy player, is an example. But that is pre-LLM, right? That's actually before the current wave of language technologies. So what we have now is something that produces, the written equivalent of glossolalia, and that is being shaped into something that sounds more like regular language, more like a human being, by different processes that are put on top of it.
What's LOM? Did you say LOM? What's pre-LOM?
An LLM is a large language model.
Oh, large language model.
Large language model is the underlying technology, but not the only technology in these corporate systems that everyone's talking about nowadays as generative AI, textual generative AI.
Yeah.
And so specifically, it's the transformer architecture of a neural net, and a very large model trained on a great deal of data, so that there are billions, sometimes hundreds of billions of parameters, different weights in that neural network. And that's the fundamental technology.
Yeah.
And then there's other things that are put on top, and we could get into what they are, to try to prevent offensive outputs, or to try to correct for the fact that these models can't do arithmetic, but computers have perfectly good ways of doing arithmetic. So let's just hook the calculator up to it, and other things like that.
Yeah. Very good. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Well, I don't think that one can have. I don't think I can have happiness without meaning. I wouldn't want to be. I wouldn't want to lead a life that was somehow of pleasurable sensation, but anesthetized to the meaning of the world.
The question I got from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, he says, happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning does.
Mm-hmm.
So does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Yeah, so I mean, consciousness is a phenomenon of mind, right? I would say, and that so it's not exactly, although it's certainly related to the brain, and it's an open question, one that I don't. This doesn't play into my research. I don't weigh in on this. I don't write op-eds or hot takes, think pieces, or anything like this. But I find it interesting to read about ideas of whether or not mind and consciousness can be achieved without the particular, not just the brain that human beings have, but the entire life that human beings have, right? The brain embodied in us, and the brain experiencing through the body and as part of the body, the world.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Well, the speed of thought can't be faster. Nothing can be faster than the speed of light. But I would say the speed of thought is considerably slower, because we have a lot of synaptic work to do to get thoughts out. I mean, if you wanted to actually read up on this, which I haven't done recently, there's fascinating evidence that a lot of decision making that people do, they make, you ask them to make a choice, and you try to find out, the human perceptual ability, which is like to be able to perceive and react something like 200 milliseconds. There's a lower limit of 200 milliseconds. Like, people can't actually respond to things in less than that time. And so you look at people making choices, and again, you have them in an MRI, and they'll make these choices. Their neurons will fire to do something at like 180 milliseconds. So it really doesn't make any sense. They've made the choice before they can perceive and process what's going on. So actually, maybe I'm talking myself out of my answer. Maybe that is faster than the speed of light, but you'd have to talk to someone more capable than I about this. That's a type of paradox of neurophysiology that I read a little bit about and was fascinated by. It's one of these things, that's in Thinking Slow and Fast, Daniel Kahneman, or various types of books of that ilk.
Yeah. Well, no, I tend to want people to say, I ask all these questions because I want to hear people answer them the way I like, but I love that people don't. So it expands my vision, expands my thinking and my feelings. And I appreciate it, because just saying, well, I talk myself out of it, because didn't we think up the speed of light? So that's the proof. We thought that up. And so, it's back to you changing the word to mind, because if you notice how I word that, I go, does the brain more detect, no, does the brain more detect or create consciousness? And then I followed up was, do we more detect? So then I change it from brain to we. But you put it, no, it's the mind. So it's always like, what
Yeah.
word do I put? What noun or verb do I put? So you're helping me psychoanalyze all these questions. I appreciate
And
that.
Jerry, I would definitely be careful about ideas that that we made up the speed of light, because I don't know how tall the buildings are there in Venice, California. I haven't had the pleasure of visiting. I know, Ray Bradbury, having lived there, and how nice it is. But were you to think, oh, we just made up gravity, that's just a human invention, and you go to a tall building and try to test your theory. Oh, I'll just think about something else. Then you find that no, we didn't. There's something we discover about the universe, right? So,
Well, that's probably going to, I know right now I would probably ask you for a part 2, and that's where we get into the difference between art and science. But this is something you dabble in, because the word poetry is in your bio in the first line or two. Audre Lorde said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer, her colleague, said, well, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
so I think there's many different types of tools. There's granularities. Most things have been, particularly if we're talking about, let's talk about computation. Okay, we'd also talk about poetry, right? Because my work is about poetry and computation coming together. So poetry has its own technologies of memory, right? Which you were mentioning with regard to Songs in the Bahamas about how to survive a tsunami, right? The fact is those poems, even being oral and not having an inscription, have materiality, which is their meter, rhythm, rhyme, if whatever of those is applicable, that causes them to be mnemonic, right? So those are technologies, and those technologies. I mean, if you go back to the Odyssey and the Iliad, they now seem to us to be, amazing literary works that open our understanding into this predecessor culture. But those are technologies to memorialize the glories of war, right? In the case of the Iliad, yeah. And to recount the names of the heroes, and to promise that should you go to fight and die, that your name will also be recorded in epic like this. And so that's the harder case. Computing is obviously part of the military industrial academic complex. It comes out of projects during World War II in the UK, in the US, in Germany. And ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, was developed to compute artillery firing tables initially. That was his first task. So it was adapted then for business purposes. But other people like Allison Knowles in downtown New York, using the Fortran programming language and collaborating with James Tinney, figured out that we can have this variable, world-encompassing poem that is generated and printed out by a computer as early as 1967. And there's earlier examples of creative text generation. If we don't, the question is, what's the master's tools, the master's media, right? We could say, well, communities didn't develop TV stations, so let's throw away community TV, because that's a tool of the master, right? We can't do it with that. I mean, the printing press was not developed for subversion. It was developed to print Bibles. right? That was the first use of it in the West. So that was a technology of the master as well. So when we get down to the nuts and bolts of this, and we're talking about media technologies, we find that almost everything has an unpleasant story of that media technology being devised. I think
wait a minute. Where did you get that concept? Because that's sort of mind blowing. So you're saying every human. Now, let me just clarify what you just said. That's brilliant. Every human. Well, here's what McLuhan says: every invention has services and disservices.
yes.
But you just said every invention, technology,
media technology.
Right, yeah. But he used the word media as being a technology or an invention, meaning every.
Sure. An extension of man. Yeah.
Extension of humans. So every spoken word, the stick used as a tool, everyone is rooted in some negativeness or some disservice, but it's equally rooted in a service, isn't it? You're saying no, it's more rooted.
Well,
because let me, Nick, one more thing.
Sure.
There's a book that says the internet was invented by hippies on LSD. It's a pretty good book. I haven't read it, but you know what I'm saying. But they didn't actually invent it. Maybe the government invented it and then they hijacked it for better reasons. So Are you saying there is this sort of leaning that every invention has, I don't know how to say the right word, devious origins?
Well, first of all, I'm not talking about every invention. So I don't think, I don't know I don't know how McLuhan would describe it, but I don't think like insulin and landmines are inventions. I don't think those are media. And by the way, they can both be used to kill people.
Exactly.
But one of them is better, right? One of them is better than the other. They have a certain valence. And they also arise out of, one of them is a sort of tool of military technology. The other devised to heal people and help people. So the things that I'm particularly talking about is what are conventionally understood more narrowly as media technologies, right?
Yeah.
And specifically, my real focus and interest is in computing. And in the early days of computing, the push to develop computers definitely came because of their military applications.
Yeah.
Now, there's a road from there. And so when you have like a Commodore 64 that's for sale for $400, that somebody can take home and hook up to their TV and start playing around with, learning how to program, playing games. Things have changed, right, about that technology. I use the passive voice, but of course, people change them. People did make that technology into something else. It was Jack Trammell, who, although he was a business as war type of guy, he said, "I make computers for the masses, not the classes." And he wanted to make these affordable computers, which he did. There's the idea that I think you have to identify if it's a system of oppression, right? If that's what you imagine as a tool, right? Then using that same system of oppression against authority and oppressors, I think, is very challenging.
Yeah.
But once the nature of computing is that, for instance, it didn't stay in hermetic rooms attended by priestly attendants, who had to take your punch cards. It became more accessible. Again, I'm using the passive voice, but it's because of the technology development that was done, right? People thought, let's take the potential of this technology in new directions. Let's advance it. Let's bring it out to people. And that allowed for many, many creative uses, subversive uses. And it didn't solve everything. I mean, if you look at social media nowadays, right? Social media, like back when we were blogging, I mentioned WordPress. Back when we were blogging, those were the happy days of, everything's great. Like we're, people, human beings connected to other people's blogs and commenting on each other's blogs. And then social media with their sort of walled gardens, and billionaires taking over and developing white supremacist sites, things like this. After out of a major, so I've removed everything of mine from what used to be called Twitter, but I made thousands of tweets, over the years. I think it shows that there are ways that the master's tools can be used, but once you think that you are addressing oppression, solving the problem, doing something bottom up, that can be flipped around. Not in every case, but in some cases, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's good. Zappa says, hey, you got to change the world from working within the system, and there's variations. You can do it, and it's our duty to invent new ways to change things for the better and make the world a better place. So,
we're talking about the matrix, right? The question is there anything outside the system, right?
Yeah.
So unless someone offers to extricate us and bring us to the world of Zion and go around in the Nebuchadnezzar or something, then we have to do what we can from in here.
Yeah, well, the manifesto is reading Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people, because as my essay says, can art save war? It's right there in the Finnegan's Wake. He's propagating. Is are humans more hardwired for cooperation or more hardwired for war and violence? So this question on tool you really handled well, Nick. And since I asked it so often, what new tool do you suggest? Somebody said, well, how about a toy? So then I've added this question. What new toy do you suggest?
Yeah, well, I think computers are great toys, actually. And in fact, I gave a talk in Mexico City about powerful toys, which I was speaking about very small computer programs, not LLMs, right?
Yeah.
Small language models, you might say, tiny language models, systems that people could look at the program, completely understand it, and they could modify it themselves. They could share it. Yeah. They could even make it the basis of their own art projects if they wanted to, or literary projects, right? So those are the things that allow you to play with computing. And we had this already in the late 70s and 80s. People got their computer, and at first they didn't really know, like, why do I have this Apple II? Why do I have this Commodore 64? Maybe it'll be good for my kid. Maybe there's an educational value. Maybe I can put the household budget, on it, or I don't know. They weren't sure. They didn't even know where to put it. So you see these advertisements where it's on the kitchen table, because nobody has a home office or anything at this point, right? Yeah. The home computer was just developed, right? It was just invented. They sold it, and so you see everybody sitting around the computer on the kitchen table. Where are they going to eat dinner? Like, we know, right? So nobody really could figure out these computers, but nevertheless, they were willing to play around. They were willing to write these little programs, see how it worked, learn about computation. And some of those people, who learned about computing that way, didn't do a computer science undergraduate degree or anything like that, but they brought that into their poetry and into their writing and into their artwork, including my co-editor, Lillian von Bertram, who they learned how to program in BASIC, around that time. So those are some sorts of toys, I think, that are powerful ways to learn.
Yeah, because the word toy implies play, and that's what you do with music. Because as Walter Pater said, all art aspires to the condition of music. Because you play music, you don't work music.
In English. In English, you play it, but in Spanish, like, you don't play the guitar in Spanish, you touch the guitar.
Well, very good. I never knew that one. You touch it in Spanish.
Tocar la guitarra.
That's Zappa and a bunch of rock guitarists were at that famous guitar store in New York, and Segovia came in to have his guitar fixed. And the
Yeah.
guy goes, "What do you think of these rock guys?" And he goes, "They're holding the guitar all wrong. Spanish, we hold it up to our heart. We play
Yes.
it up here."
There you
That's
go. One
that is
was playing the
really
guitar,
smart.
and the others were playing the guitar.
Yeah, that's really good. But then someone said artwork, and I hated that because you can play art, but a lot of it is artwork, you know.
Yeah.
So, anyways, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Um, so, yeah, I mean, right now it's usually just the next day because I've got, particularly because it's been so wonderful with my daughter. My spouse is back to work full time, all except for 2 days a week, weekend. And so I'm doing the childcare the rest of the time. And now we're getting into like book launch events. We had a book launch event last night for Output. I'm going to the European book launch. My first time away from my daughter for, ever. So it's basically just stuff like what's coming up next. That's one of the things that just having something going on.
Yeah.
I don't feel the weight of big issues as much because, for instance, with this book project Output, I really want to get it out to people.
Yeah.
I want, we've spent more than 4 years on it, and there's a phase of follow through. It's like when I never could do this right, but when you swing a baseball bat, and you hit the ball, you have to keep going. And so, so we're working on that phase of stuff. I actually had another book that was published 2 days ago from publisher, fine art publisher in Montreal. So I'll have to start announcing and promoting that. And
well, good luck, Nick. This is great. You're bringing in your current projects because I know you're very prolific. So McLuhan learned from a poet that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Nick, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
Well, so I think you use the word hidden is one hint to why that is. And another hint is that you use the word artists. And people it's not that people don't pay any attention to artwork, but they often consider it as something that, maybe it has aesthetic beauty, but it doesn't open up new thinking or understanding. To follow up on McLuhan's view, I would give Lake Evan Turner's view of poets in More Than Cruel Reason, where they argue that poets do not invent metaphor, that poets never have invented, no poet has ever invented a metaphor. The metaphors are already out there in culture. Something like life is a journey, a year is a lifetime, a day is a lifetime, people are plants. All of these sorts of metaphors, they pre-exist. So no poet made these things up. But what poets do is they combine, elaborate, and question these metaphors. And because of that, Lake Evan Turner say their role is extremely important. That and actually, I think, goes beyond. McLuhan's focused on media and invention, but what Lake Evan Turner say is that poets are artists of the mind. That they help to inflect the thinking that people have, because they're not going to come up with a new method. Conceptual metaphor is shared by all of us. It's so important. It's grounded in everyone's common experience. But by questioning or elaborating that metaphor, by combining two metaphors in a novel way, that's a possibility for actually helping people to think in new ways. Now, as I was saying with artists, they just need to read poetry. That's the thing. That's the,
Okay, Nick, let me clarify one thing, because you're again teaching me so much. Did you imply or did you say that Lakoff in a book entitled More Than, what's the title of the book?
Okay. It is, no, I won't get it. I moved it, but it's called More Than Cool Reason, a field guide to poetic metaphor, a field guide to poetic metaphor.
The fourth word is
George Lakoff and Mark Turner.
Yeah, and it's cool reason. Okay, that's good, because here's one of Marshall's main things. We need to invent new questions and new metaphors. So my friend wrote for the New York Times. He says, I says, you should come to our McLuhan meeting. He said, okay. He says, what should I read? I goes, don't read anything. He's unreadable. Don't worry about it. And he read some McLuhan. He goes, this guy's a poet. So, the key thing about Marshall.
Start at the beginning. The Mechanical Bride is great.
Yeah. Well, this is most people misunderstand, and Donald Thiel nailed it. He said,
but I think the way that McLuhan puts it, that we need new metaphors. I think that it's Lakoff and Turner's concept is much more subtle. It's that nobody can just come up with a new metaphor, right? It's like saying, for instance, like let me invent a new way of walking. I'll invent a new gait.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I know you can walk, amble, sidle, run, but everything that already exists, I'm just going to come up with a new one. It's like the Ministry of Silly Walks in Monty Python or something, right? Yeah. So no, we're not really going to do that. We're not actually going to come up with a new gait that becomes, I mean, even if it became a TikTok phenomenon or whatever else, people are not going to adopt that as a way of locomotion. Yeah. So we can't do something that's so grounded in the body as metaphor. We can't come up with something new, but poets can nevertheless have significant influence in that. We get new metaphors over time, but it's only by people combining, elaborating, and questioning the ones that we already have. I think it's sort of like, Buckminster Fuller saying, I don't know if you know his grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah. But it says on there, call me Trim Tab. And one word, Trim Tab. Call me Trim Tab. And the Trim Tab on a large vessel, a large ocean-going vessel, you can't directly turn the rudder of the boat. So there's a small sort of rudder that's called a Trim Tab. And the way you get the boat to move, or the ship, actually, it's a big ship, not a small boat. The way you get the ship to move is the pilot has to turn the trim tab, and that turns the rudder, and then the ship turns, right? So I think that's the way. That's a consistent idea with, Lakoff and Turner's idea of poets as artists of the mind, not a new metaphor emerging like Athena from the head of Zeus. Which is really not a metaphor I invented, I can tell you.
Really, really good. And he's, Bucky and Marshall hung out a lot together, and they crossed over. But Donald Thiel, one of Marshall's students and sort of a critic at one point, or just really got deep into probing McLuhan, said Marshall teased people to believe his percepts were concepts. So he's in the conceptual world of academia. So people think his stuff is conceptual and theories, and they're not. He would leave Wikipedia calling him a media theorist. He says, no, leave that. But he would also say, I'm not a theorist. I don't give theories. I just give questions and probes, and they appear. He teases people. That's what he got from Joyce and Chesterton and all his heroes, So do artists have moral obligation?
Well, I think everybody has moral obligations, not just artists.
Yeah.
But do they have special moral obligations because they're artists? People ask, there's an interview with Duchamp somewhat late in his life. He went down, here in New York to have just some spaghetti with butter, and talk to some guy and do this interview. And and it was actually, it must have been during that period of his life when everybody thought he was just playing chess, but he was working on état donné.
Yeah.
And so he gave his perspective on artists, and he said, we're just like bakers. Like, don't think that we're special, different people. Like we make art and bakers make bread. And so that's sort of the other, that's a very different view than poets or artists of the mind. Right. But it is ultimately the activity of poetry is making poems, right? It's not being a demagogue. it's not leading people and through other means, into some other mode of thought, or to rallying them or something like this. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think that there's any. I think that the moral obligations, we should treat other people like we want to be treated. But I don't think that's different for poets and artists than for other people.
Nick, let's stay on poetry for a few minutes here, because I appreciate that. Because they asked Rex Roth, what's the purpose of poetry? To subvert the bourgeois and woo your lover. And, Gary Snyder said the task of a poet is seeing the world without language, then putting that seeing into language. What's the function of poetry?
Well, as you can already tell from what you told me, it's different for different people.
Yeah.
Right. And so let me just tell you a few functions that it has for other people before I tell you the function it has for me. Right. So for some people, it is expressive. Right. And they want to deal with maybe their personal histories, issues of identity and trauma. And, that's what's important in poetry. And so how effectively that's done, would be the metric of how well the poetry works for that person. Right. So that's the sort of, they're trying to express things. So it's communicative, but it's also personal. And they're trying to be intentional about what they write. It's not just something, they're not using the I Ching, right, to put things together in a way that's out of their control. Now, there are people who use the I Ching, like John Cage, Jackson McLough, and other poets who use chance operations. Their attempts are to be non-expressive and non-intentional.
Yeah.
And so not really, I mean, even in some cases, maybe to sort of sublimate oneself in a Zen Buddhistic way, and just sort of let things happen through these chance operations. So that's not exactly me either. And there are actually people also, and another category I'm not in, who are expressive and non-intentional. And the surrealists are the preeminent example in this category. They want to express the unconscious. They want to express things that they would not sit down and write unless they did things like exquisite corpse, automatic writing, right? These types of games, right? And so, but they're not doing that just for kicks. They're not doing it for its own sake. They're specifically doing it because they want to surface the unconscious, right? So that's expressive still, but it's also something that's non-intentional. They're using a method, right, that's non-intentional. So I would categorize myself in the fourth quadrant here as someone whose work is non-expressive. I do not have any interest in expressing things about my own personal history or emotional state. And it's also intentional. So I work at that writing using, not by rolling the dice, not by using the I Ching, but by adhering to processes that I've contrived.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of setting me in the field of different writers. And then to be concise about why I bother to do this, right? I'm interested in the exploration of language. And through language, all of these other things that language is entangled with, histories, cultures, in the case of English, wars, invasions, colonialism, right? That's all in the language.
Yeah.
The influence of Norman French and Anglo-Saxon to begin with, and the terms from throughout the world which come from colonial conquests, and native, indigenous terms from the United States, like kayak and canoe and things like this that are in the language. So all of this stuff is, like it's there, but I don't start with those things. I'm not first and foremost trying to say, let me learn about the history of the world from the standpoint of England and the United States or something. I say, let me explore English. And as I do that, as I become an explorer of English, right, I will bump into all these other things.
That was really good, Nick. You really said, you're so articulate. That quadrant is amazing. And I asked for 90 minutes and we got about 15 more minutes. Can you go a little longer? You got to end in 15.
Let's do 20 maybe.
Okay, 20 is perfect. Just gives me. So the wake is language about language. Okay, so here is something that I'd love to talk to you about. And it comes about because I'm going to tell you this little setup that I've learned. Poe invented effects precede causes, reasoning backwards, the detective novel. I'm only going to give you so much information that I'm going to swoosh you into the experience by you going, I know what's going to happen next. That's, in the term effects precede causes, I'm very curious your thoughts on that. But Mallarmé is one of the symbolists who were directly spawned out of Poe. Yeah. And Mallarmé said, hey, don't paint the painting, paint the effect you want on it, which spawned, Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain. That it doesn't matter what I say, it's how the effect I want to have on you. And they're all, acknowledge the symbolist's influence. Leo Bersani, who just died about a year ago, studied Mallarmé, and he said, the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. So before you go into effects precede causes, any thoughts on that line that Leo wrote? The very crisis which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Well, poetry has been, again, I keep using these computational terms, but some of them I find actually shed some insight onto things. So poetry has often been accused of being a write-only. You can change your file permissions to be, read-only, read-write, write-only. And poetry has been accused of being a read-only genre, a write-only genre, which means that people write poetry, but they don't read it. Right? Yeah. It's something they'll write in their notebook and things like this. So I think you have to ask the scale of the crisis that you're talking about. Are you talking about people who identify as poets, the thing they do as poets? Or are you talking about people who you might see in a coffee house, they're writing something in a notebook? This is not something that's close to their identity. It's not maybe work that they care to or aim to have published or anything. But you say, what are you writing? I'm writing a poem, right? So there's lots of people who write poetry, probably many more than read it, actually. And so that's its own, possible type of crisis. But I also, I don't know. I think as I tried to line out, there's people who engage in poetry. They write poetry for many different reasons. And so the people who are trying to be expressive of their personal history, issues with trauma in their life or things about their personal identity, they may not have any interest in the explorations of language that I and other people with similar perspectives and similar practices have to do. Similarly, the projects of, there's still people who are doing things along the lines of those surrealist projects and those chance-based projects, and they're all different. So I think one of the things is to what extent can one access the work that that's interesting to you? Like how easy or hard is it for you to find a community of poets or access recent contemporary writing that is aligned with what you do? I don't see. I don't know that there's much of a crisis in that sense for people who are writing poetry. There's, in fact, this is one of the things where billionaires still haven't crushed the ability of individuals to start and sustain poetry magazines online. So we're actually in a very good spot, I think, where you don't have to get things shipped around by the post office, and you don't have to undertake curious, deep explorations of what these journals are. You can open these things in your browser and take a look.
Yeah, there's a poet that says poets should be the politicians and run the world. And when I heard Nikki Giovanni died today on Amy Goodman, I cried. It was like she had a huge impact on people, and she promoted poetry, and she was known worldwide as an important poet. So it is amazing what you just said, because I'm curious, being so involved in poetry and so involved in computers, this affects perceived causes, and this that Louis, and thanks for being such a great listener. You listen to this these questions, because I overdo quotes before the question and I go off on a million tangents. But this whole thing of Mallarmé, learning affects perceived causes, or not learning it, but sort of Poe inventing affects perceived causes or reasoning backwards, and then affecting Mallarmé and the symbolists. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I take a more open sort of idea where I want to lay bare a particular concept and the language that participates in that. And for many of us in this case, there is some effect that is orchestrated to deal with that, sometimes in a material way, but there's no sort of I want to let me show you and tell you a little bit about my book that was just published like 2 days ago, because first of all, because I love to flog it, but also because it's quite remote from Poe, who I think is a great poet and critic, very important in American letters, and also the inventor of many genres of fiction. But it's very, very different than this affects perceived causes type of idea. So my book is called, as I hope you can see, it's called Narcissism.
Yeah.
And it's done in this, I think, very beautiful edition by fine press publisher Antiism in Montreal. And it's Smith sewn. They only promised it to be perfect bound, but they own the only Smith sewing machine in Montreal. So they did it on that. And when you open it up, you see this. You see that it's
a mirror.
There's a silvered page. So the book begins. I'll examine myself and describe myself using the following process. Go through each line, describing each token, For each, describe the ASCII characters that constitute it. For each, enumerate the 8 bits that are used to represent it. Line 1, the shebang user bin Python 3, consisting of the character number sign 001 00010 and the character exclamation point 001 00001 and the character slash 001 01 111. And so this goes on for 48 pages. This is a computer program, the output of this computer program, whose only purpose is to exhaustively describe itself down to the level of the bit. So there's no reveal here. That's what the book is. There is a connection between the material nature of the book, right? So this is a book that uses a process in computing that's called reflection, right? And it's meant to be a narcissistic computer program. It's a computer program that only does something to itself. And what it does is it examines itself in obsessive and unnecessary detail. And so the appearance of it, I mean, much like looking at something like Tom Phillips' Humament, which is much more legible than this book, you can see that there's different patterns. There's sort of rivers, as Phillips calls them, of text that go along here, and so that that's one example of a book that it sort of makes a promise, it fulfills it. It's not the magic trick with the prestige at the end. It's all it is offering you a concept and the fulfillment of this concept. Like you see it in a materially suitable form, and you understand, hopefully. I mean, there's very, I don't know, what do you understand, if anything? It could be a futile exercise. It is a futile exercise. But this is a representation of that computer program, much as the source code would be. You can go and get the original page of code. In fact, one of my friends and colleagues here in town who just got the book said, okay, I'm going to now recover the original program by going through this book and figuring out what it was. And so, it provides that type of activity, but it's a sort of literal riddle, right? Like what lives in the river? A fish. It doesn't actually have any sort of cleverness or payoff to it. It's nevertheless meant to provoke thought about language and computing in these particular ways, and also the material form of the book. Why would this be done as a book? Why not put it online as a file? Right?
The tactility of a book. So good. Nick evoked McLuhan updated his most known aphorism mid-career. It was medium is the massage or medium is the message.
Yes.
Mid-career, he said, nope, it's no longer that. Now it's the user is the content. And so that's sort of what reminded me of that, is like the user is the content.
Yeah.
The very, very, saying rivers of text is very Finnegan's Wakean, especially.
Well, the thing about this is you can see it through the rearview mirrw.
Yeah,
also, McLuhan-esque about it, right? Yeah. So there's
look at that rear view mirrorism. So why don't we end part one with this question, and I hope we could do, even 4 or 5 months down the line, do a part two where we get into Joyce and computers and especially the Wake. And so, are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Oh, well, definitely old ideas, right? I mean, I don't think, first of all, there's a question about how many new ideas there are, right? It's sort of like hearkening back to, my reading of Lake Evan Turner and More Than Cool Reason, where we don't really come up with new metaphors. At best, we can start to inflect them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the reason that we need to inflect them is because there's things that are, the understated way of saying it is problematic, right? There's issues with the way that we've thought in the past, and so we have. I mean, just politically, like you think about I won't even name the isms or the ocracies that we might bring to mind, but I'll name one of them, which is democracy in terms of the United States, democratic experiment. I mean, we have a country that was founded, in the Constitution, determining that certain people here would be 3/5 of a human being. Women weren't included until even after those people, the male people in that category, were officially allowed to participate in the democracy as full citizens. So, even if we think back to the idealism of what we might make great again, things like this, those ideas were, those are ideas I'm afraid of. Yeah, I have to say, not to say that there's nothing about them, not to say that there's no redemptive hints, in political history and the history of moral thought, certainly in literature. But yeah, I mean, even the best and most admired sort of ideas they have elements of them, I think, that are things to fear. We're now really in a situation, as bad as things may seem, we also have the capability, just like those people looking at poetry magazines have such a wider way of accessing that work online. Just like we're talking by video, we wouldn't have this interview 20 years ago. Just like we have Fetterman's Wake Society of New York meetings online. In all these sorts of ways, we have these capabilities to collaborate, to communicate, to work together on building a better future. Now, we can get embittered or nihilistic about this, and we can put that aside. But if we use the technology to develop slowly, piecemeal, perhaps, through inflecting our existing metaphors, through coming up with new aspects of ideas, if we build better futures that way, I think that's a very positive thing. I think that's a very positive capability that we have, despite everything that's going on with the collapse of social media and with elections and governments and so forth. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity for people to work together at the community level and beyond to devise new collaborative futures.
So well put, Nick. Yeah, I got the question from Cage, in fact. He says, I can't understand why people are frightened of new ideas. I'm frightened of the old ones. And Charles Kettering said it. People are very open-minded about new things, as long as they're exactly like the old ones.
Yes.
And actually,
I'm glad I found out that I'm on Cage's side here. That's good.
Yeah. It's funny because it was 1939 where telephone, which we're on right now, came out in the New York World's Fair in 1939. So that's when it first started becoming a semi-reality. And then I want to tell you so much how I enjoy your input again. You're usually really witty and funny, and you were so linear for 90 minutes. I want to get into the crazy Nick who throws out all these amazing puns in the future, and we can dig deeper into art and science, James Joyce. And thank you so much for your time and energy, Nick.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, thanks for inviting me. This is a great conversation. And I'll look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
I'll hit the end broadcast button now, but I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
All right.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, take it easy.